Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon on the East Coast and good morning, everybody on the West Coast and the Pacific. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Soberall. I'm a member of the Science Collaborative staff, and we're glad you can join us for today's webinar on decision support for siting of shellfish aquaculture. The webinar today is part of a monthly webinar series that features projects funded by the Science Collaborative as well as partners as they engage with the reserve system. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a national network of 29 unique research reserves, as shown on the map here. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research, and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. The research it supports is highly collaborative and integrates end users into the research process to create products that support coastal management needs. For today's webinar, all attendees have been muted upon entry, and we will handle questions via the question feature on the GoToWebinar console. We'll save time for questions at the end of the webinar, but we encourage you to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar by entering them into the questions field on the webinar console, which is right here. Questions are visible to organizers only, so we'll have to verbalize them for you. So with that, we'll introduce our speakers for today. We have three speakers who are going to present with us today: Beth Darrow, Martin Posey, and Doug Bell. Beth Darrow has over 10 years scientific experience working with shellfish ecology, aquaculture, and estuarine ecology and biogeochemistry in Virginia and the Gulf of Mexico. As project lead, she focused on quantifying the environmental effects of oyster farms and oversaw data collection from the field and lab that drove the development of the oyster farm model and coordinated connections with end users. Martin Posey is a benthic ecologist with many years experience in research and advisory roles on ecosystem services of shellfish populations. He has worked extensively with resource and user advisory groups at the regional, state, and national level and has worked on a number of restoration efforts. Martin served as the collaboration lead for the project and supervised a graduate student who conducted experiments on the habitat use of oyster aquaculture, as well as several undergraduates involved with sampling work. And last but not least, Doug Bell is an aquatic ecologist by training, whose research has focused on nutrient biogeochemistry and phytoplankton ecology in freshwater, estuarine, and open ocean systems. Doug joined and led a spin-off project inspired by the Science Collaborative study, which assessed the current activities, approaches, and relevant policy to shellfish aquaculture across the reserve system. So Beth and Martin are going to start us off with some background on their project, so I'll pass it over to Beth.
Thanks so much, Nick. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see you here today. So today we're going to talk about what we thought originally was a rather unique situation, which is aquaculture in a reserve. Oops. Go back. Excuse me for just a moment while I try to figure out these controls. Let's see. Go back to the title slide. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So we had a 3-year Neuroscience Collaborative project examining ecosystem services and impacts of oyster aquaculture in the North Carolina National Estuarine Reserve. The results of this project are being used to provide models and decision support tools that we have provided to resource managers. But before we go too far, we wanted to ask you all a question and pretend that you are some of our stakeholders. So we have a poll here. Anybody could hop on. So in your opinion, which of the following topics should influence shellfish aquaculture siting decisions? And we're going to make you just select one of the following. So we have commercial or recreational uses of the proposed lease area, protected status of the proposed lease area, for example, it's a state preserve, environmental impacts of specific leases, ecosystem services of specific leases, or viewscape of the proposed lease area. So if you can go ahead and pick your favorite, that would be great. I think Nick is gonna keep an eye on the poll, and when it looks like it's almost done, he will show us the results. All right, so it looks like environmental impacts of specific leases was the most popular choice here, followed by commercial or recreational uses of the area, ecosystem services of the specific leases, followed by protected status of the proposed lease area, and viewscape of the proposed lease area. So this is really interesting. Some of you may have been frustrated that you had to have just chosen one, and probably a lot of you were thinking, well, it really depends, right? So we found similar results, as you will see. All right. So I'm having trouble advancing the slides, Nick, so I don't know if I can just ask you to advance it for me. Okay. So with a little bit of background, I'm going to turn it over to Martin Posey to give you a little bit of background on policy implications in North Carolina.
In understanding sort of the background to our general project, it's used to review the general discussions that were happening regarding expanding aquaculture in North Carolina at the time we started. Over the past several years, there's been a lot of interest within North Carolina about the possibility of significantly expanding our shellfish aquaculture industry. This is, of course, for economic reasons. Many of the coastal areas of North Carolina are economically challenged, and also we look to our neighbors to the north, which have much larger shellfish operations. This is exemplified, the interest is exemplified by North Carolina General Assembly actually requesting a report on the potential for economic growth of the shellfish industry in North Carolina. This led to the North Carolina Strategic Plan for Shellfish Mariculture, which indicated we could potentially increase the shellfish industry by almost tenfold over the next 10 years. However, with this discussion came also discussion of how do we make decisions about siting all these new aquaculture farms? What is the limits? What is the carrying capacity for the number of farms we can have? What about potential conflicts, especially since North Carolina is a public waters resource use state? What are the what about areas that within suitable biological conditions that really should be available for aquaculture? Just because an area is suitable, which of those areas really should have aquaculture in them? So these are among the variety of questions that were being asked over the past several years, along with a debate about potential environmental impacts of aquaculture. To what extent is it really affecting adjacent habitats? So this provides a little of the background of where we were at the start of our project from a sort of statewide management perspective.
Next slide, please. So the idea for this specific project emerged in 2015 when 2 new oyster leases were permitted within the Masonboro component of the North Carolina National Estuarine Research Reserve. These are some of the cleanest waters in an uninhabited barrier island near Wilmington, North Carolina. And some stakeholders had reservations about whether aquaculture should be allowed within a reserve. And the reserve requested a moratorium on any new leases until the environmental impacts of these leases could be studied. Understanding the ecosystem services was also a stated reserve need at that time. So we gathered a group of researchers whose specialties were examining environmental impacts and ecosystem services of shellfish aquaculture, and then also gathered a group of stakeholders to give feedback on the project, including the reserve, and submitted a proposal to the NERRS Science Collaborative. We call this project Shellfish Aquaculture and Reserves, Ecosystem Services, or SHARES for short. Next slide, please. So the project objectives, as submitted, were to assess the environmental impacts, including ecosystem services of shellfish aquaculture in the North Carolina National Estuarine Research Reserve and other areas in southeastern North Carolina. Use stakeholder input to select parameters and sites of interest and to guide research questions, and to provide information to end users that would be useful for decision making. So today we'll show you a little bit of data, but we'll also show you the tool that we're proposing that can be used by decision makers to help guide conversations about this issue. Next slide, please. And this just shows us some of our stakeholders represented by these logos here. We also called end users. End users are the people who are planning on using the project data to actually make a decision on the issue. We wanted to recognize that this is a potentially contentious issue and that members of our stakeholder group may have different views on it. So we wanted to emphasize that while the different groups of end users may have different priorities, a lot of these priorities actually overlap. And we were hoping that recognizing similarities in values would help with consensus building around shellfish aquaculture decision making. So on the left here, we have the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, who is ultimately responsible for the shellfish leasing decision-making process in North Carolina. They're also tasked with managing user conflicts and avoiding negative environmental impacts of shellfish farms. On the right, we have the North Carolina National Estuarine Research Reserve, whose priorities included balancing research, education, recreation, commercial fishing, or aquaculture uses. And they were also interested in ecosystem service valuation and how management decisions impact water quality. And finally, we had shellfish growers from these farms and also other local and regional farms who were interested in sustainable growth of the aquaculture industry. They wanted the economic opportunity and to minimize financial risks and maximize production, but they also wanted to have high quality products and increasingly said that they wanted to use the ecosystem benefits of aquaculture as a selling or marketing point. Some of them even requested the farm model tool to be used on their farms to help estimate nitrogen removal. So we wanted to produce project outputs that would address all of these priorities, including data and models that would aid decision making. And we're also hoping for an outcome of closer relationships between resource managers and the shellfish aquaculture industry. Next slide, please. So after the project was funded, but even from the writing stage, we sought feedback from stakeholders on what they wanted. After the project was funded, we hosted 2 workshops in the first year where we used various exercises to come up with a mission statement for the group. And here is our mission statement that we came up with. The blue are the characteristics of the group that the group was looking for, sort of our MO. And the orange are the parameters to be measured broadly that they were most concerned about. And then the yellow were the long-term goals of the group. And I'll read the full mission statement. Through open communication, diverse perspectives, and shared goals, the stakeholder group will advise research on the questions of shellfish cultivation impacts on wild oyster resource, habitat, and water quality change, leading to a better understanding of the environmental influences of shellfish cultivation to ensure the development of an informed policy and a common language. So this might be a lofty goal, but you have to start with something. And I think that it was really helpful in guiding our conversations. We then took the orange questions and turned them into a new proposed environmental criteria in a shellfish aquaculture decision-making framework. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to walk through this. This framework is modified from a GIS-based shellfish aquaculture siting tool designed by Silva et al. For use in Europe. We modified this and used it as a discussion point in our stakeholder meetings. So in the upper right, you'll see a GIS siting tool. North Carolina has an existing GIS-based siting tool that was developed by the Benthic Ecology Lab that includes geographic constraints, which include legal constraints and use conflicts, including some environmental considerations such as presence of essential fish habitat. And while there's a lot of nuance here that's not really reflected, this stage 1 is basically what the Division of Marine Fisheries currently uses to help decide if areas are suitable for shellfish aquaculture. These further stages, 2 and 3, the kind of boxes below, could help decision makers further refine decisions if they wanted to consider environmental impacts, for example, in a reserve. So you would have to decide which factors, these blue kind of parallelograms here, are the most important to consider. So here we decided that resource effects or wild oysters, environmental effects, which were sediment and water quality, ecological impacts such as habitat, and growth and survival of the wild and cultured shellfish were the most important considerations. And then these would be evaluated against criteria. So what are the allowable or suitable ranges for these factors? We decided to assess these against areas outside of the shellfish farms for comparison, but you could also use historical data or baseline data for these criteria. Assuming that environmental factors were okay, you could then further refine and choose the best areas according to where the farms would be most productive in stage 3, and or where they might have the most impact in terms of ecosystem services. And then one of these potential tools would be a carrying capacity model to make this determination. So it's, again, a lofty goal, but basically by laying out these factors and having these conversations, it helps crystallize what factors decision makers are using to make these decisions, as we'll see. Next slide, please. Okay, so where did we apply these tools? These are our sites. On the left is the Mason-Burrow National Estuarine Research Reserve that I mentioned before. It's an intertidal site on a barrier island. It has a lot of flushing from the intercoastal waterway and the ocean, and it's fairly oligotrophic. Oysters were grown on 2 farms in bottom waters and using water column gear. We also chose a site outside of the reserve, also in southeastern North Carolina, but with different characteristics, so we could contrast. The New River is subtidal. It's a little deeper. It's more of a traditional river estuary. It is fairly eutrophic, and it's currently on the 303D list for impaired waters, although the area where oysters are grown is approved for shellfish harvest. The oysters here were grown in bottom trays. Next slide, please. Here's a timeline as we laid it out. In year 1, we focused work on our Mason-Burrow site, collecting samples for wild oyster health, sediment, and water quality. We also collected data from the farms themselves to use in the farm model and did physiology experiments. In year 2, we added the New River as a site, and we also added habitat nekton sampling and continued our farm practice data collection. And we had a significant impact on our project, which we could chat about later if you want, which was Hurricane Florence, which hit us squarely in North Carolina. Year 3, we've been incorporating our data into models, analyzing data, and discussing our results with stakeholders. Next slide, please. The plan was all well and good, but the decision-making process was short-circuited because in 2017, just as we were getting started, a determination was made by the North Carolina Department of Natural Resources, finding that aquaculture is inconsistent with the Mason-Burrow site's purpose as a nature preserve. This meant that the leases would not be renewed at the end of 5 years, or in 2020. Needless to say, this made our stakeholder meetings interesting. However, I think because we had laid the groundwork to include growers in these stakeholder meetings and had open conversations and an attitude of mutual respect, they actually kept participating despite having some difficult conversations. They also kept their farms going in the interest of using them for research. So we were able to move forward with the fieldwork and modeling studies, examining the farms as they were at that time. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll give just a brief overview of results for our fieldwork. If anyone has more detailed questions, feel free to contact us, and then also look for publications coming out soon. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so we measured a number of different sediment attributes to determine if the presence of farms changed the organic matter or nutrients enriching the sediments below. So the idea is if the sediments were becoming highly enriched by oyster biodeposits falling to the seafloor, we would expect extractable ammonium, for example, to increase as that organic matter is remineralized. So ammonium is naturally occurring, but further enrichment would indicate potentially the beginnings of a problem. I have just a couple example dates to show here. We have March on the left and September on the right of 2018. And then the top 2 figures are from the Mason-Burrow site and the bottom 2 are from the New River site. The farm sediments are the black bars, mudflats are white, and the natural oyster reefs are gray. So here we can see that in Mason-Burrow, the extractable ammonium was not significantly different at farms than the non-farmed locations in either of these months. And this was very typical for the 2 years of data that we collected. In the New River in March, the lower left slide, we had farm sediments with similar amounts of ammonium to the natural shellfish reefs, the gray there. However, in September, the farms, the black bar, which is circled, had significantly higher ammonium than the other 2 types of sites within that river. Now, this was after Hurricane Florence, so we think that a few things happened. The New River received a large amount of floodwater and sediments, which stratified the water column and caused hypoxia. A number of oysters died. As you remember, these are bottom culture, and we think that further enriched the sediments with organic matter. Meanwhile, the Mason Borough sites were shallower, more thoroughly flushed, and were back to normal fairly soon after Hurricane Florence. But I will say that at the New River, the farm sediments were comparable to non-farm sediments by December of that same year. So 3 months later, back to equal amounts of ammonium. Next slide, please. Just an example of some of our water column data. Chlorophyll A is food for oysters. This is biomarker for phytoplankton biomass. And one concern was that oysters could locally deplete phytoplankton, reducing food supply to wild fauna. So we sampled this monthly. And in the upper slide, you can see chlorophyll on the y-axis at Mason Borough, samples taken monthly through time over the 2 years. The stations within the farm footprint are black, and the stations outside of the farm are open symbols. You can see that the seasonal pattern across the farm is very similar through time for 2 years. At the New River farm, where we sampled in 2018 only, we saw mostly the same pattern. Seasonal changes were much more visible than differences across the farm. There were a few exceptions, however. We could observe local chlorophyll depletion within the farm in June, August, and September. These are times when oysters were metabolizing at their highest, but there are also times when there's plenty of food in the water. At no time did chlorophyll concentrations go to zero. So if anything, this could be evidence of oysters reducing eutrophication and improving water quality at certain times of the year. Next slide, please. So we use the farm model to further estimate this ecosystem service of particulate nitrogen removal for the first time in the southeastern United States. This model was developed by our collaborators, Joao Ferreira and Suzanne Bricker in 2007, and has been used successfully in a number of systems from Chesapeake Bay to China. The farm model is relatively simple. It just models the farm itself, not the whole river or bay. It can calculate farm production, filtration carrying capacity, and the influence that the farm might have on eutrophication. So it simulates the food coming into the farm. You can see the red arrow on the left. Food is removed by the oysters and converted to biomass, and the water passes out the other side with less food. The nitrogen in the food is removed, converted to biomass, and then harvested and removed from the water body. Next slide, please. So I'll show you some hot off the presses results for these farms. We run the farm model for 2 years for the Mason Borough farms, farms 1 and farm 2, and just for the 1 year for 2018 that we had the environmental data for, but we used 2 different gear types, seed start dates for farm 3. On the left axis, we have nitrogen removed by the farm in kilograms of nitrogen per acre per year. So the Mason Borough farm ranged from 100 to 225 kilograms of nitrogen per acre per year. And the New River farm was lower at about 50 kilograms of nitrogen per acre per year. Now, I will say that the farm 3 was larger, so for the entire farm, it actually removed more nitrogen per year. We can also scale this up to person equivalents of nitrogen. You can see the conversion factors on the right, as well as to a nutrient offset credit value. So we used a value from the Neuse River watershed for the state of North Carolina of $6.55 per kilogram, and came up with, let's see, between $1,600 and $7,300 in avoided nitrogen costs per acre farmed. The other thing to take note of is that the nitrogen removed per area was highest for farms with higher stocking density. So farmers can really have a big impact on how much nitrogen is removed depending on their farm practices. All right, so now I'm going to transition back to Martin, who's going to talk about the wild resource and habitat impacts.
Well, the overall goal of looking at the wild oysters and their associated communities was to detect possible impacts of aquaculture operations on the adjacent habitats. With respect to the oysters, we sampled them near oyster operations, which are shown with the red here, and we sampled them in more distant areas. We'll call these control or reference areas. In these reefs, we did biomarker analysis, which I'll mention in a second. We looked at oyster demography and densities, and we looked at settlement patterns of oysters. We also look at the associated fauna, the animals living within the oyster reefs for these same sets of reefs near aquaculture operations and further away. And we also looked at nekton utilization of these habitats. Well, first of all, biomarkers. This is work done by Suzanne Brander and Kelsey Billett. Biomarkers are proteins produced in response to stress or metabolic changes. We have a number of these that have been identified for oysters, and those represented the suite of biomarkers that we looked at. We found that oysters near aquaculture operations did have increases in 3 biomarkers related to physiological stress as well as metabolic activity. With respect to the wild oysters, we found that there was a trend towards larger sized oysters and reefs near the oyster farms on most sampling dates. In fact, all but one sampling date. There's a trend towards higher density in reefs near the oyster farms as well. So we not only had larger size, we had higher densities in the reefs nearer to the oyster farms on most sampling dates. We also saw a trend towards higher condition index in reefs near the oyster farms on most sampling periods. Condition index looks at the relative weight of tissue relative to the volume of the shell. Down below, you can see a representative figure looking at size distribution and abundance of oysters. This is for winter 2017-18 and 2018-19. The pink bars are the oysters that are further away in the control areas. The gray and the gold represent those that are nearer the aquaculture operations. You can see in both years we get higher abundances near the aquaculture operations as well as a tendency towards greater size. Oops. Okay, one of the things that we also had an opportunity to look at by accident was the impacts of hurricanes on some of these reefs. So this is one of those unexpected aspects that you get when you're working in the field. In fall of 2018, we had Hurricane Florence strongly impact the southeastern North Carolina coast. Fall 2018 was the wettest year on record for this area, and Hurricane Florence dropped over 2 feet of rain as it sort of ambled across the region for about a 4-day period. So this obviously was a very significant event in our region, and we see a very strong response within the oyster population. In the lower left hand, we have the settlement of oysters onto spat plates. So this looks at the immediate settlement of oyster a few weeks after the hurricane passed. If you notice this dark bar, that's the 2018 data, we see a dramatic spike in the settlement of oysters with the passage of this hurricane. Looking in the upper left, upper right-hand corner, this shows the actual densities of these small oysters newly settled on the reef for several months post hurricane. Here's the hurricane. We see a dramatic increase in these newly settled oysters persisting months post hurricane. If you look at fall periods in other years, are just a fraction of the same settlement rate. We also see lower condition of oysters post hurricane, which was this period here, shown in this lower right-hand figure, which is not surprising because often newly settled spat have a slightly lower condition index. With respect to associated fauna, of our reef-associated fauna, those are the taxa found within the reef metrics. They include polychaete worms, such as this clam worm at the top, xanthid crabs, such as you see in the middle, mussels, slipper shells, various other species utilizing the oyster matrix. These species showed variability among years, but did not exhibit consistent differences among impacted versus more distant reefs. Several taxa, especially your polychaetes, exhibited strong declines after Hurricane Florence relative to the same times in previous years. With respect to our nekton, these are the various finfish, shrimp, crabs, more mobile species that are coming and going often tidally. Most taxa exhibited higher abundances associated with structure, whether it was aquaculture operations or wild reefs. However, there seemed to be no consistent difference in utilization among the structural habitats, wild reefs versus aquaculture operations. So now I'll turn it back over to Beth to talk about a summary of the general project results.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So just in summary, and we have a 2-pager on our project website if anyone would like to grab it. In general, our water samples showed no changes across farms or in farms compared to non-farmed areas. Our sediments showed some localized limited increases in ammonium, for example, under farms in some months, but not consistently. Our wild oysters had higher density and larger oysters on reefs nearer to farms. And for habitat, there was a higher abundance of motile animals, especially around structures. So this includes wild reefs as well as farms. Go ahead. Okay, got it. All right, so how are these results used? Remember our decision support tool. They go here in stage 2 and were available to be considered by stakeholders. But as I mentioned, prior to the project's end, a decision was made about leases in Mason Borough that did not incorporate proposed environmental criteria, but was based on Mason Borough's status as a dedicated nature preserve. So these legal constraints are shown in the decision support tool for Mason Borough in stage 1, indicating that these leases were unable to proceed beyond that consideration. This decision was made before project data were available, but those data that I mentioned showed a lack of environmental or ecological impacts that could be considered in stage 2, as well as successful growth, harvest, and nitrogen sequestration by farmed oysters in stage 3. The New River lease had limited legal constraints that had already passed through stage 1 or environmental impacts, although we did not measure all of the same types of impacts in the New River. But it also had suitable production and substantial nitrogen sequestration in stage 3. Okay, so what did this mean to stakeholders? We have some quotes here from our final stakeholder meeting where they said things like, there is possibly less environmental impact of shellfish aquaculture within a reserve than outside, but also less opportunity to have a positive effect on water quality. And the sites that are more preferable for aquaculture siting could be the sites where water quality could benefit the most. The unofficial consensus seemed to be that aquaculture could do the most good and maybe have less user conflict in areas of poor or marginal water quality, rather than in reserves where water quality is already good. Of course, that has to be balanced with the sanitary safety and quality of these areas, so it's sort of a fine line there. If you're interested in using this framework for your own conversations about siting decisions in your own region, you can go to the website and download this tool from the NERRS Science Collaborative and modify it as needed. Okay, so what are the implications of this project? We're just starting to see those. But one example is the implications of this farm model. So when we talk to state resource managers, we can talk in terms of the entire state. We have farms from 2 different locations and 2 different types of embayments. And we can use that range in the nitrogen mitigation values to scale up to the state as a whole and get an idea of that ecosystem service that aquaculture is providing to the state when we talk to policymakers. So for just a back of the envelope calculation, we now have about 2,000 acres of shellfish leases in North Carolina, which is about 30,000 to 140,000 person equivalents of nitrogen removed per year. So that's the equivalent of that many people's worth of nitrogen that gets into our embayments. And this has a really conservative value of $3 to $14 million in nitrogen mitigation value. And this is just for the harvestable oysters. We aren't considering things like denitrification, which has been considered by some other projects and is an ongoing research area. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Martin.
Okay. As Beth indicated, there's a variety of implications regarding management of shellfish aquaculture in North Carolina. Foremost, there's much current discussion about the degree to which we should be expanding shellfish aquaculture and where it should be expanded. Some of the current issues include partially the potential environmental impacts of shellfish aquaculture, especially intensive cage culture, siting, where should the operations be located, and potential conflicts and potential resolution of those contexts. North Carolina is a public resource use water state. The waters of North Carolina are available to all, and clearly that raises interesting questions with respect to the placement of aquaculture operations. This study helps address these issues by providing evidence on ecosystem responses to a moderate scale aquaculture operation, suggests a process that may contribute to siting decisions, and applies a developing model to quantify some of the environmental impacts, including, for example, the nitrogen removal rates. Okay, next. Mine stopped forwarding for some reason.
Next slide, please. All right, so for some next steps, we're already starting to go in some new exciting research directions. The questions kept coming up in our stakeholder meetings, wondering how common is shellfish aquaculture in the NERRS system in general? Is North Carolina a typical NERRS? Are we faced with similar decisions here that people are in other areas? And how are these decisions made across the reserve system? In 2017, Suzanne Bricker and I conducted an initial exploratory survey across the NERRS system to see if this issue or if similar issues had been experienced in other reserves. That exploratory assessment was able to carry forward just this past year and expand with an available colleague, Dr. Doug Bell from Sea Grant, who started working with Suzanne and me to explore this issue further. So Doug is going to talk a little bit about this expansion and kind of new direction that piggybacked from this project. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, thanks, Beth. Yeah, so the next few slides will cover the secondary project that we have also titled Shellfish Aquaculture in the NERRS. The project team was myself, located in the National Sea Grant Office, Beth, Suzanne Bricker. Suzanne is in the Cooperative Oxford Lab within NOAA's NCOS, and then also with Chris Kincaid, who is within NOAA's Office of Coastal Management, who is also the NERRS Research Coordinator. So in the interest of time, I'm going to try to run through this fairly quickly. This is also the first time we've presented this work, so we're quite eager to do so. And as Beth mentioned, at the time of North Carolina's determination, Beth and Suzanne were curious at how prevalent these similar issues may exist across the NERRS. Is this activity actually considered inconsistent in the NERRS? It's considered inconsistent with North Carolina's preserve, but what about the NERRS more broadly? And even more broadly than that, with shellfish aquaculture expanding, what has been or what should be the NERRS role in addressing it and researching those issues? And we state that question rhetorically. The study was not meant to answer this, but more so review and highlight the current activities, the regulatory framework, and approaches to shellfish aquaculture within the NERRS system. And again, the intention of this assessment was really to synthesize information, because we believe that's really key for sharing best management practices as the industry matures and expands, and then especially the nuances and differences across each state. So this was primarily done through a questionnaire survey. We expanded the one that Beth and Suzanne released in 2017. We released it earlier this year in 2020. And then the study also included a broad review of relevant NERRS policy, relevant Fed and state regs, guidance documents, really anything I could get my hands on and process in a month or so. But I'm just going to cover the questionnaire highlights. Next slide, please, Nick. So first, and perhaps the biggest takeaway was really getting full participation from all the NERRS. So we had 100% participation. All 29 reserves gave some feedback, so thank you to each one of those. With the survey results, we were able to interpret and categorize whether or not there was the presence of aquaculture, the degree of suitability, the rationale for that suitability, whether or not there was neighboring activity, and whether or not there was engagement with aquaculture within or abutting to the reserve boundaries. And so a quick by the numbers approach, we found that there were 12 reserves that hold aquaculture. These are in orange. 11 were specific to shellfish farms. 17 reserves were considered suitable or potentially suitable. These are designated by either a solid or dashed underline. And then either through the survey results or we look through each one of the NERRS management plans and assess whether or not it was explicitly considered a long-term pre-existing use and designated within a NERRS before or as the reserve was starting up. And we only found that there were 4 that did so. And then lastly, we asked the reserves if they had assessed or observed any socioeconomic or environmental impacts, and overall, there weren't too many reported or known issues. Two reserves cited that they didn't observe any effects when they were looking for them, and then there was just one minor effect, one negative minor effect that was, I believe, quickly mitigated against. So a quick transition here on the slide, please, Nick. And so the take-home message here with just the survey results is we think that they truly represented the NERRS as they are just a unique assemblage of estuarine systems that possess a range of suitability for and current engagement with shellfish aquaculture. But we also understand that there's this limited ability of a survey, so we did speak a little bit more in depth with a few of the reserves, hopefully trying to do like a regional perspective. Nick, one more slide. And the key lesson learned from those interviews was that the reserves, this is somewhat expected by us, I think, they displayed key roles as coordinating entities and also as a trusted source of science. We put down a few case examples that we found here on this map. And then the other lesson learned, I think, from the whole study is that the reserve's approach to shellfish aquaculture is certainly locally focused, but also with patterns from a regional influence. This was due to either a state or region's geographic setting, historical shellfish populations, use of their coastal landscape, and shellfish aquaculture regulations and management. And so in summary, overall, we're preparing this to get submitted to a journal, but we do hope this assessment will enable more dialogue and collaborative opportunities by researchers, educators, coordinators, growers, and the general public too. And already for the NERRS, we've already discussed this work within the proposed Connecticut Reserve. So hopefully it's proving to be useful for them as they develop their management plan, and also as other reserves come online, or as other reserves, take another glance at their management plan and how they approach shellfish aquaculture in the reserve. With that, one more click, Nick. And I just want to give a final thank you to all the reserves that participated in this, and especially those that gave us more time. It was really great to talk to each one of the reserves a little bit more explicitly. So with that, let me toss it back over to Beth.
Great, thanks, Doug. Next slide, please. All right, I'm gonna leave some final lessons learned here with you all, and if we ever get a chance, I'd love to chat about some of these over beer with some of you. So as Martin alluded, sometimes it pays to leave your gear in a field during a hurricane. Thankfully, he was able to retrieve his gear, get some really interesting results. I also had a current meter out there that I was very glad to get back that had some interesting data. Sometimes you leave it out there against your will. Number two, I was given some advice in graduate school, and I found this totally to be true. Hire a great technician. It is worth the money, and the NERRS Science Collaborative allowed us to do that, to have somebody to coordinate all this field work and our student schedules and just do a great job. When working with stakeholders, especially, pick up the phone and call people. So in this digital age, we're all getting more used to email and text messages and things like that, but not everybody operates that way. So it's important to remember that some people will respond so much better, if at all, if you just pick up the phone and call them. You can also kind of corner people like state management agencies if you call them. It's kind of surprising for them, and they might give you their honest opinion. Then use your network and a snowball approach to bring in stakeholders. I was really grateful to work with a wonderful team of collaborators who all had their contacts and were able to reach out to some really interesting people who brought in unique perspectives. And then finally, often the policy moves faster than the science. So that's what we saw in this project. But that doesn't mean that the science won't be used. There's always the next policy. So we don't know what's happening down the road. And we're finding that what we discovered in our state could be useful to other states as well. And then I think from Doug's work that he's been doing in the interviews that we had across reserves, I'm going to take this home with me, is having a consistent group of stakeholders across projects and grants and across funding cycles can be really helpful. So I think GTM is doing a really effective job at this. I think Kirsten Wasson with the Olympia Oyster Group is doing a great job with this. And it's really inspiring to see how a stakeholder group can take on a life of its own and keep the momentum going even when maybe there lacks funding, but they can be in place for the next project. So next slide, please. With that, I just wanted to convey my thanks to especially our funding source, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System Science Collaborative. I wanted to thank Lynn Vaccaro, who's been our program manager through this project and through all the ups and downs. And I especially wanted to thank 3 key groups of people who we couldn't have done this project without. On the left are our students who spent hours in the field in the lab and hopefully learned a lot. In the middle, we have our growers who, again, we could not have done this work without them. They even helped us take samples, including sediment samples, which was a lot of fun. And then finally, the rest of the stakeholder group, our natural resource managers, as well as local citizens who sacrificed a lot of their time and provided their insights into the whole process. So thank you so much. And with that, I think we might be able to take some questions.
Yes, thanks, Beth. Thank you to our presenters. We advance here to our Q&A section. We've got some questions rolling in already. Lynn and I are going to work together to sort of get these questions lined up and verbalize them to our panelists. So first question we have, did Hurricane Florence or other storms cause some farm gear to be lost? Sounds like maybe it might have. I'm wondering if gear loss and litter will become a problem as oyster farming expands.
In our case, these farms did not lose much gear. If they did temporarily, I think maybe some of it from one farm went into the marsh and they were able to recover it. But I have heard of other places definitely losing gear. And that was definitely a concern that came up among our stakeholders. That's something that is brought up repeatedly with natural resource managers, that they want to make sure that there's a way to minimize the impact of marine debris from these systems. So I think that that is something that the aquaculture industry needs to take seriously and consider if they want to keep expanding. Martin, do you want to contribute to that at all?
Hey, Beth, funny enough, the one thing that we found from the NERRS was that the negative impact was marine debris from a storm. That was the only one.
Right.
Yeah, and I think as the floating cage culture expands, that is something will have to be considered, because that'll be more susceptible to perhaps loss during hurricane than heavy, large bottom cage culture.
Awesome, thank you. And we'll move on to the next question. In waters unsuitable for shellfish consumption, is there a possibility for oyster farmers to grow and receive income for water quality remediation, for example, through nutrient trading credits?
I will try to address that. So nutrient trading credits don't exist in North Carolina yet. It's just starting to be developed in some areas such as Chesapeake Bay for actually harvestable shellfish. So we have a few steps to go in North Carolina before we can even get to a dollar being put in a farmer's pocket for nutrient mitigation. In terms of areas that are not suitable for shellfish growth, we do have a relay policy in North Carolina. So some growers will actually move oysters from closed areas and move them out to uncontaminated areas where they have to sit for a period of time, and then they are allowed to harvest those. So that might be a potential solution for handling oysters that can help in more contaminated areas, but that eventually we want to move into a product. Martin, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, we do have a relay system, but it is very strictly overseen and very limited. So I think in North Carolina, that's probably not going to be a major effort. What I see as probably more than doing aquaculture in closed areas is as doing restoration in closed areas for nitrogen benefits, where you're adding in your oysters. They're going to have some nitrogen removal benefits because of enhanced denitrification, and that might be a more widely done process than actually growing them for closed areas for later human consumption.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question for clarification about some of the findings. It says, your results summary and results indicate there was no difference in water quality due to shellfish farming, but the farm model estimates nitrogen removal as being substantial. Are the fluxes just too high to detect differences in nitrogen in the water quality monitoring?
Yep, that's exactly it. So in these areas, we have a lot of flow, and anything that's being drawn down by the oysters, it's really difficult to observe. So anybody who's tried these types of experiments out in the field probably could tell you that measuring something upstream and downstream out in the field, you're not likely to see a really huge impact unless maybe it's a pond or something that's really overstocked. So in our areas, we have a lot of tidal movement. So anything that the oysters are feeding on, yes, they're removing things, obviously, because they're growing, and we can quantify that. But by the time that water has moved past, it's really difficult to detect those small changes. So that's where modeling is helpful.
Actually, I'd like to do a quick follow-up from the previous question about the growing of oysters in closed areas. I forgot to mention that currently North Carolina does not allow any aquaculture in closed areas. So that, that would also be an aspect with respect to the previous question.
I think it's possible to find areas, though, that are not closed, but that are more eutrophic, right?
Yeah.
So Pamlico Sound, we know, has had water quality issues for a long time. It's not necessarily bacteria that is causing those issues, but it's a lot of nutrients coming down the rivers and creating blooms in those areas. So there are definitely spots that are eutrophic and have nitrogen issues, but that don't necessarily aren't closed to shellfishing because of bacterial microbial issues. Anything else?
Lots of questions. Keep them coming. Is there population connectivity among farmed and wild populations? If so, are there potential genetic benefits and risks to this connectivity?
So the oysters that are used for the most part in North Carolina are triploid oysters, so they're sterile. So there can be a little bit of reversion, but for the most part, they should not be reproductively active, and they should not be having that population connectivity with wild oysters. There are some diploid oysters that are diploid, and that is definitely a cause for consideration as well. So something to be considered in each state, each region, as they create their regulations, is whether they want to consider triploid versus diploid reproductively active oysters or not.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I'm learning stuff too. Could you provide more explanation of any opposition to expanding shellfish aquaculture? What are the issues?
Martin, you want to take that?
Sure, I'll take a few of them. One issue, particularly in the southern part of the state, is this viewscape. We have, in the southern part of the state, we had relatively narrow sounds. And even those areas outside of the reserve is a relatively narrow water body. And there has been quite a bit of concern in terms of the viewscape, particularly as we move towards floating operations. So you can basically see them, they're visible, and there's sort of the idea that aquaculture may be fine, but I don't want the operation in front of my yard, sort of aspect. So viewscape is one. Another issue is this whole idea of public use waters, which is an interesting issue because the waters need to be available for a variety of uses. In fact, in siting aquaculture, it's not supposed to significantly impact or impact to an undue respect other uses. And of course, the presence of an aquaculture facility does have some impacts in terms of use. So that's something North Carolina is working through, is placement of shellfish operations and this sort of public use resource waters. And also just general location of the siting. Many farmers would prefer to site closer to access areas which are closer to often development areas. There are areas that might be very good for shellfish aquaculture further away, but that then adds cost and effort. So Beth, I don't know if you want to add any to those.
Doug might have some. That did Martin cover everything that you were seeing, concerns that were raised by reserves?
Yeah, I think maybe two other things is just the choice of uses between commercial activities as well. If commercial activities are in an area and they have other, say not just commercial, but recreational fishing, like say recreational fishing in a NERRS, what does that mean for some other commercial activity? And then the other thing I think that Connecticut has to think about is other types of habitat. So either like essential fish habitat or some aquatic vegetation. You might have some activities that are doing restoration, that are improving in the habitat. You might get some boundaries forming. And if you have, expansion of some lease areas going into, a restored area, and people have wanted to keep those separate, those might be other concerns as well that I've seen pop up.
And in North Carolina, that's also a consideration. You can't get a lease where there's above a certain threshold of seagrass present. Same thing, you don't get a lease where there's already an oyster bed is defined by a certain threshold of live oysters. Interestingly, we do have areas where seagrass is expanding, which is great, but what happens if it expands into an existing oyster operation, which is kinds of questions sometimes we have to deal with.
And maybe one more thing with the reserves is that ones that didn't have aquaculture, and one of the main reasons was just bad water quality. So whether or not that expansion might not be from other, use conflicts or things like that, is just the water's not good enough.
Okay, we've got another follow-up question. Does North Carolina consider existing shellfish and submerged aquatic vegetation habitats in making a siting determination? If oyster farming is desired in an area of hard clams or submerged vegetation, what does the decision tree look like for that circumstance?
With respect, hard clams I'm not as familiar with. With both oysters and seagrass, it's in rulemaking that you cannot establish an oyster operation when seagrass exceeds a certain level, which is a fairly low threshold of blade presence. They regulate that the surveys need to be done during times of seagrass peak biomass. Many of you may know we are unusual in that we're the northern limit for Haller-Dooley, or the southern limit for Zostra. So we do get fairly strong seasonality. So that is set in rulemaking that you can't have the operations when you have a survey indicate above a threshold of seagrass. The same thing goes for existing oyster area. If there's above a certain threshold, which is relatively low in live oysters per acre, you can't have an oyster operation as well.
Yeah, just to follow up, there's a rule about hard clams as well. I can't remember exactly what the density is, but our farm in the New River, that's something that they had to consider, especially in the New River. So that would all go in that stage 1. So that's kind of where it is, where we are already. Those would be some of the regulatory constraints that are already under consideration in the current legal framework.
Running short on time here, so I'll try to ask maybe one more question, but first we got a comment from our participant that just says, I noticed that harmful algal blooms are not included in your decision support tool. They can make shellfish unsafe to eat, but another problem that is not well known is that some algal blooms can kill shellfish or hurt recruitment. They're saying that in the context of the lower Chesapeake Bay. Any comments on that additional comment?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is something that we discussed in stakeholder meetings, and in the areas where we had proposed hadn't really been a major concern for our stakeholders. So that's where I think taking that maybe framework of the decision support tool and then modifying it to your local and regional concerns, talking to your stakeholders, your end users of the decision-making process is really important. So if that's a concern in lower Chesapeake Bay, then you might want to include that. I mean, it may even go in stage 1 that if harmful algal blooms, toxins are above a certain concentration, then you can't proceed. I think that some areas have those kinds of regulations, including with their shellfish sanitation.
Anything to add, Doug or Martin?
Nothing to really add, no.
Okay, so we have time for just one more question here. I know we're out of time, but I just want to make sure that we can get this kind of nice little next steps question in. Are there any plans to examine changes after leases and farm operations ended?
Not right now. I guess we would require a new project to continue that type of work. I do hope that the reserve considers going back after the leases are still, I think they're still pulling their gear out this year. They can be there till the end of 2020 within Mason Borough Reserve. So that would be a good thing to go back and investigate and see if there have been any changes and if there are changes through time. Farm 3 in the new river is still there and still going strong. He just added some water column operations. So that might be another interesting thing to look at as he's ramping up a little more if there are further changes in the new river.
Okay, well, I know we're out of time here. We've gone slightly over the time and we didn't get a chance to answer all the questions, but to those of you who did submit questions, we'll try to get those answered and included in the slide deck, which we'll post in the next couple days to the reserves website, to the Science Collaborative's website for this webinar. So I just want to say a quick upcoming announcement for our next webinar, which is in November 18th, and it is on measuring climate adaptation success. So it'll be the resilience metrics tool, which Susie Moser and Kristen Goodrich will present. And with that, since I know we were out of time, just another quick huge thank you to Beth and Doug and Martin for taking the time to be with us today and for answering all of our great questions, putting together a very thoughtful presentation. They really dug into this presentation. I know that because I was in the prep calls with them. So they really put a lot of thought into this, and we appreciate the effort that goes into these webinars. So thank you all, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick.